I never thought I'd be the kind of man who'd end up waging a private war from the seat of an old wooden dock. But then again, I never expected the suburbs to come looking for a fight on my own doorstep. My name is Miller Vance. I'm 62 years old, and for the better part of 3 decades, I made my living as a high-pressure pipe fitter and site foreman, dealing with the kind of heavy infrastructure that doesn't and oppos care about your feelings or your aesthetic preferences. After my wife, Sarah, passed away from a sudden stroke 6 years ago, the noise of the city just started to sound like static. So I took my retirement savings and moved out to the only place that ever felt like home, 40 acres of rugged timberland and a deep, spring-fed basin we called Blackwood Pond. It wasn't a pond, really, but a massive, crystal-clear lake that my grandfather had secured the rights to back when the county was mostly cattle and dust, and for a long time, it was just me, the loons, and the ghost of the woman I loved. But then came the development, a sprawling, cookie-cutter nightmare called Willow Creek Estates that started crawling up the eastern ridge like a slow-moving rash, bringing with it a homeowners association led by a woman named Brenda Sterling. Brenda was the kind of person who wore a blazer to a backyard barbecue and looked at a forest not as a living thing, but as an unorganized floor plan that needed a manager. It started with the neighborly visits, Brenda showing up at my perimeter fence in her pristine white SUV, waving a clipboard and talking about, community synergy, and shared aquatic assets, as if my lake was just a giant swimming pool that I was selfishly keeping to myself. I told her, as politely as a man with my temper can, that Blackwood Pond was private property, deeded and documented, and that Willow Creek's jurisdiction ended exactly where my gravel driveway began, but Brenda just gave me that tight, patronizing smile, the kind you give a child who doesn't and oppos to understand why they have to eat their vegetables. She started sending these glossy newsletters to my mailbox, even though I was an oppos TA member, featuring mock-ups of what she called the Willow Creek signature waterfront experience, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw a digital rendering of a massive 2-story floating glass pavilion sitting right in the center of my water. I laughed it off at first, thinking it was just the delusional fever dream of a bored suburban socialite, until the Monday morning I woke up to the sound of hydraulic brakes and the smell of diesel. I walked down to the shoreline in my undershirt, coffee in hand, and saw 2 flatbed trucks unloading massive blue modular pontoons and steel girders onto the marshy bank that marked the edge of the HOA's common ground. They weren't in oppos, just planning a gazebo. They were building a full-scale commercial bistro and bar, a floating monstrosity they'd branded the Driftwood Lounge, and they were preparing to tow it right into the deepest part of my lake. I found Brenda directing a crew of divers, looking like she was presiding over the construction of the Great Pyramids, and when I asked her what the hell she thought she was doing, she didn't oppose to even look at me. She just adjusted her sunglasses and said, Miller, we've reviewed the 1994 watershed amendments, and since your lake is fed by a public tributary, the surface rights fall under community recreation guidelines, so we're moving forward with the project for the benefit of all our residents, I told her she was hallucinating, that a tributary doesn't oppos grant a private club the right to build a restaurant on my backyard, and I held up my folder of original topographic maps, but she just waved a hand at the construction crew and told them to keep working, muttering something about how, recluses shouldn't oppos to be allowed to hoard the scenery, For the next 3 weeks, my sanctuary became a war zone. The rhythmic hammering of steel on steel echoing off the hills and the bright yellow construction lights burning through the night, turning my quiet evenings into a neon-lit nightmare. I called the sheriff, I called the county zoning board, I even called the Department of Natural Resources, but Brenda had done her homework, or at least she'd greased the right wheels because every agency told me the same thing. It's a civil boundary dispute, Mr. Vance, and until the court issues a stay, the permits are technically valid. It was a surgical strike designed to move faster than the legal system, a classic HOA tactic where they build first and let the lawyers sort out the rubble 10 years later, and I could see the smug satisfaction on Brenda's face every time she saw me watching from my dock. She even had the audacity to send Noise and privacy curfew, end quote. Notice to my house, telling me that my early morning fishing was, end quote. Disturbing the ambience, end quote, of the future patrons of the lounge, as if I was the intruder in my own life. By the time the structure was 70% complete, the lake was starting to die. A thick, oily film from the construction barges began coating the reeds, and the pair of nesting herons that Sarah and I had watched for a decade finally gave up and flew north, leaving behind a hollow silence. I spent a week in a dark place, sitting in my kitchen with a bottle of bourbon, feeling like a failure, like I was letting Sarah down by letting these people pave over the only piece of her I had left, until I remembered something my father told me back when we were installing the primary levee system in the late 70s. He was an old-school engineer who didn't end oppose. He trust the weather or the government, so he'd built a, end quote, kill switch, end quote, into the lake, a deep-bore manual drainage culvert hidden under a massive stone cairn on the south bank, designed to empty the entire basin into the dry ravine below in case of a catastrophic flood. It was a massive, gear-driven sluice gate that had an end oppose. T'd been touched in 40 years, and as I looked at the blueprints spread out on my table, a cold, calm realization washed over me. The Driftwood Lounge was a marvel of modern aesthetics, all glass and lightweight steel, but it was engineered for a very specific, static water level. Its anchors were fixed-length chains, and its stability relied entirely on the lake staying exactly where it was. I spent the next 3 days in my workshop, prepping my gear like I was back on a job site, cleaning the rust off my heavy-duty wrenches, and greasing a set of ancient cogs I'd machined myself to replace the ones that had seized over time. I watched the HOA host a, end quote, VIP sneak peek, end quote, on the Friday before their grand opening, seeing Brenda in a sequin gown toast champagne on the floating deck while a jazz trio played, the music drifting across the water like an insult to the grave of my piece. She caught my eye from across the lake and raised her glass with a smirk that said, end quote, I won, end quote, and in that moment I knew I wasn't an oppose. T was going to sue her. I was going to show her that nature, and the men who understand it, don and oppose. T follow HOA bylaws. At 3 a.m. on Saturday morning, under a moonless sky, I rowed my old wooden boat out to the south bank, my heart thumping against my ribs like a sledgehammer, and I started the back-breaking work of clearing the decades of debris from the stone cairn. The sluice gate was a monster, a 10-foot iron plate held in place by a threaded brass rod that felt like it had been welded shut by time, but I threw my entire weight into the crank, screaming through my grit teeth as the metal finally groaned and yielded. It was the sound of an old giant waking up, a deep, vibrating thrum that shook the very ground beneath my feet, followed by the terrifying roar of thousands of tons of water rushing into the darkness of the ravine below. I sat back on a muddy bank, drenched in sweat and shivering from the adrenaline, and I watched. At first, you couldn't and oppose, see the change, but you could hear it. The tension in the mooring lines of the floating bistro began to hum, a high-pitched, metallic whine that cut through the night as the water receded and the chains went taut. The restaurant didn't and oppose. Have a, end quote, float, end quote, range. It was anchored to the floor like a tethered balloon, and as the lake level dropped by a foot, then 2, then 3, the buoyancy of the pontoon started fighting against the unbreakable steel of the anchors. By 5:30 a.m., the lake had dropped nearly 5 feet, and the pristine, glass-walled Driftwood Lounge was no longer level. It was tilting at a sickening 15-degree angle, its modular floorboards creaking and popping like gunshots as the structural frame began to twist under the uneven pressure. I stood on my porch with a fresh cup of coffee and watched as the first of the HOA security guard arrived, his flashlight sweeping across a shoreline that had suddenly expanded by 20 feet, revealing a graveyard of old tires, sunken logs, and the jagged rocks of a lake bed. Then came the scream, a high-pitched, frantic sound that could only belong to Brenda Sterling, as she pulled up in her white SUV and saw her $2 million community centerpiece lurching toward the mud like a dying animal. The restaurant was an oppose, just sinking. It was being pulled apart by its own mooring system. The the glass walls shattering into a million shimmering diamonds as the roof buckled, and the expensive interior furniture slid in a chaotic heap against the downslope windows. Brenda ran down to the new, muddy shoreline, her expensive shoes sinking into the muck, shouting at her confused maintenance crew to, and quote, turn the water back on, and quote, as if there was a faucet she could just twist. And when she saw me standing there, she went absolutely feral. She stomped across the property line, her face a mask of purple rage, pointing a shaking finger at the empty expanse of the lake and screaming, and quote, you did this. You've destroyed community property. You've committed a felony. I'll have you in prison for the rest of your life. You bitter old man. End quote. I just took a slow sip of my coffee, looked her right in the eye, and said, end quote, Brenda, I told you this lake was private, and that includes the drainage rights. I noticed a bit of an indopos, overflow risk indopos, in my personal records and decided to perform some much-needed maintenance on my infrastructure. And if your little clubhouse couldn't indopos, T-handle A. Change in the weather, well, that sounds like a catastrophic engineering oversight on your part. End quote. The next few hours were a beautiful, chaotic symphony of local news vans, fire trucks, and a very confused county sheriff who spent most of his time looking at my perfectly legal 40-year-old permits for the drainage system. Because I hadn't indopos, T touched their building, and I hadn't indopos. T trespassed on their land, and it was simply operating a licensed water control feature on my own deeded property. There was an indopos. T a damn thing they could do to arrest me on the spot. The end quote, driftwood lounge, end quote, eventually hit the bottom of the lake bed with a sickening thud, its pontoons crushed and its sleek, modern aesthetic reduced to a pile of soggy drywall and broken glass, sitting in a foot of sludge. The legal fallout was a hurricane. Brenda tried to sue me for every sin I had, claiming, and quote, malicious interference, and quote, but my lawyer, a shark of a man who specialized in rural land rights, pointed out that the HOA had built a permanent structure on an unfinalized conditional permit without a proper hydrological survey. If they had done the survey, they would have found the drainage valve in the public records, and the fact that they didn't and oppose meant the entire project was a massive liability that the HOA's insurance company refused to cover. The Willow Creek Board ended up eating the $2 million loss. Brenda was ousted in a humiliating public meeting where the residents found out their monthly dues were going to triple to pay off the demolition costs. And the end quote, signature waterfront experience, end quote, was officially canceled. It took a year for the lake to fill back up to its natural level, but when it did, the water felt cleaner, the silt had been flushed out, and by the following spring, the herons were back, standing like sentinels on the eastern bank. I still sit on my dock every evening, and sometimes I see the new HOA president, a quiet guy who actually knows how to fish, waving at me from the ridge, and I wave back because as long as they stay on their side of the fence, we're the best neighbors in the world. But I can in oppos, help, but wonder, is it really, in quote, progress, in quote, when we try to force the wild parts of this world to fit into a spreadsheet, or are we all just one open valve away from realizing we don in oppos? Own nearly as much as we think we do? I'd love to hear what you think. Did I go too far by draining the life out of that pond to save it? Or is there a point where a man has to remind the world that, in quote, private property, in quote, still means something? Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever had to fight an HOA and don in oppos. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the edge of the woods.